You need to pack tonight. Piers Norwell, 44-year-old chief executive of Norwell Developments and husband of Hazel Dre Norwell, said it without looking up from the envelope in his hands. The front hall of Ashburn House smelled of cedar and wood polish, the same as it always had, but something underneath that familiar scent had turned cold. Hortense Norwell, 68-year-old matriarch of the Norwell family and the woman who had managed Ashburn's household since before Piers had his first grey hair, stood at the top of the wide staircase, holding a set of keys, Hazel's keys, as if she had been waiting years to hold them. Carries Dunmore, 31-year-old project coordinator at Norwell Developments, stood near the fireplace in a pale dress that belonged in a magazine and not in a marriage. Hazel Dre Norwell was 36 years old. She had been Piers' wife for 11 years, and for nearly as long, the quiet engine behind everything the Norwell name touched. She had reviewed zoning applications when Piers lost track of deadlines. She had called contractors at midnight when a project threatened to fall behind. She had sat across from nervous investors and spoken in the careful, grounded language of someone who had grown up at the table of Crispin Dre, her father, the man who had built Dre Capital Group from a single provincial loan desk into one of the largest private mortgage investment corporations in Ontario. She had done all of it without ever putting her name on the door. Now she stood in the front hall with a carry-on bag at her feet and the November rain running down the tall windows, and the man she had loved for 11 years was handing her a sealed legal envelope without meeting her eyes. "The trustees feel your continued presence disrupts the estate's administration," said Fen Whitlow, 56, the Norwell family's attorney and the man who had a gift for dressing cruelty in professional language. He stood near the coat rack with his briefcase already open. "You'll receive formal documents by tomorrow morning." Hazel looked at Piers. Piers looked at the envelope. Carrie smiled the way people smile when they have already decided the outcome of something that hasn't happened yet. "Some arrangements simply run their course," she said. Hazel did not answer her. She did not raise her voice. She did not beg for anything. She picked up her bag, took the keys she would not need again from Hortense's outstretched palm, placed them on the hall table, and walked out through the front door into the November rain. What Piers did not know, what none of them knew, was that Hazel Dre Norwell had controlled Dre Capital Group's lending authority through the Dre Family Trust since the year her father died, 3 months before her wedding. The trust held majority interest in the corporation under her maiden name. Board correspondence used Hazel Dre, not Hazel Norwell. Because Piers had never asked a serious question about her father's estate, he had never learned that the private mortgage lender financing 2 of his largest active development projects, and holding the renewal conditions on a third, was operated by his wife. By the time the front door of Ashburn House closed behind her, Hazel already understood one thing with the kind of clarity that only arrives after a long period of pretending not to see. She had spent 11 years protecting a man from consequences he had earned. That part was finished. The morning before the dinner that ended her marriage, Hazel had walked the south wing of Ashburn looking for estate maintenance files. Piers had misplaced ahead of a lender review. They were eventually found in the library, tucked behind a stack of architectural renderings for a project already 3 months behind schedule. She had stayed up past midnight the night before organizing variance documents so Piers wouldn't have to admit in the meeting that he had lost track of the municipal correspondence. He had not thanked her. He rarely did. Orla Baxter, 60, head housekeeper of Ashburn House, and one of the few people on the property who spoke to Hazel without performing deference, found her in the hallway with the files under her arm. "You've been in that wing since 7, Orla said. "There was work," Hazel said. Orla looked at the files, then at Hazel's face. "There's always work," she said carefully, "when you're the only one doing it." That evening, Gideon Ash, 66, the estate's groundskeeper and the man who had worked for the Dre family before Hazel had ever met Piers, found her on the back terrace watching the sky go grey over the valley. "Leith called," Gideon said. "He left a message at the main line." Leith Sandor, 43, was Dre Capital Group's managing director and the person who ran day-to-day operations at the firm, while Hazel kept her distance from any file that touched Norwell Developments. She had insisted on that separation herself, not to protect Piers, but to protect the integrity of the lending process. If Dre Capital ever had to act against Norwell Developments in a default situation, the record had to show she was not involved. She called Leith back from the garden. "There's a problem," Leith said without preamble. "Norwell's third renewal package came in with collateral support documents we can't verify. The numbers on the residential land appraisals don't match what we have on file from 18 months ago." Hazel looked out at the pine trees at the edge of the property. "How large is the gap?" she asked. "Significant enough that our compliance team flagged it independently. We're not asking you to vote on anything. We're asking for authorization to open a conflict-screened review. Given your position, you can't be part of the committee, but your written sign-off to convene it is required by the trust documents." Hazel was quiet for a moment. "Convene the review," she said. "Document my recusal. Every decision goes through the independent committee, outside counsel and compliance. Nothing touches me directly." She hung up and went inside. The dinner had already begun to go wrong in the way. Dinners went wrong when Hortense was in charge of the seating. The place card that had read Hazel Norwell for every investor dinner she could remember had been moved to a corner table near the kitchen. In its place at the seat beside Piers sat a new card, Carries Dunmore. Hazel noticed, Gideon noticed, Orla noticed, and she quietly pressed her hand to her mouth so she would not say something in front of the guests. Hortense came down the stairs in charcoal wool and a necklace she had retrieved from Hazel's jewelry case at some point in the past week. "Some women build a family's future," Hortense said to the room in a tone designed to sound like a toast. "Others simply occupy space in its present." No one contradicted her. Piers straightened his jacket. Carries looked at Hazel across the room with an expression of practiced sympathy, the kind that required an audience to complete it. "This must be a difficult adjustment," she said. "Only for you," Hazel said quietly. Carries blinked. The sympathy slipped, just for a second. Later that night, after the guests moved to the sitting room and the staff were clearing the dinner service, Hazel stood in the hallway outside Piers' study and heard him through the half-open door. "The valuation has to hold," Piers was saying. "If Dre Capital sends in auditors, the whole Lakeview package falls apart." Knox Peel, 50, Norwell Development's chief financial officer and the most visibly anxious person in any room he occupied, answered from inside. "The gap in the appraisal numbers is too wide. If they run a full audit, then we make sure they don't," Piers said. A third voice, Hortense, "We used the Barton Road properties before. Use them again. Submit new schedule at current market." Knox said nothing for a moment. "That's not the current market value." "It will be," Hortense said, "if we choose the right appraiser." Hazel stepped back from the door. She had heard it in the careful language her father had used when he taught her to read loan files. A borrower who pressed on collateral value when the underlying asset hadn't moved was not managing a shortfall. They were manufacturing one, and if Dre Capital was already flagging the numbers independently, the gap was already in the record. The question was no longer whether the truth would surface. It was whether it would surface cleanly. She went upstairs and opened her private laptop. Dre Family Trust, Beneficiary Access Portal, Norwell Developments Limited, Active Exposure Review, Compliance Flag, Collateral Discrepancy, Independent Review Pending. She closed the screen when she heard Piers on the stairs. He came into the room already pulling at his tie, in the distracted way of a man who had convinced himself someone else would deal with the problem he had just created. "You were quiet tonight," he said. "I was listening," she said. He looked at her, then at the closed laptop. "Still fussing with those trust reports?" "Something like that," she said. He went into the bathroom without asking anything else. That was how it had always been. For 11 years, Hazel had watched Piers mistake her silence for emptiness. She had once, in the first year of their marriage, nearly told him the full scope of what she had inherited from her father. She had stopped herself at the last moment at a dinner party when she watched him dismiss a colleague with the words, "A woman with that kind of money doesn't really need to understand it. She just needs to manage not to lose it." She had understood then. Not that he was cruel, at least not yet, but that he was the kind of person who would mistake ownership for threat and call it love. The divorce papers arrived the following night. Hazel signed for the envelope in a hotel room in Barry, standing in damp clothes with her carry-on bag still unzipped on the floor. The room smelled of cleaning solution and the particular kind of quiet that exists only in places where people go when they have nowhere else to go. She read the settlement at the small desk, with the overhead light at full brightness. Piers was asking her to waive all claims connected to Norwell Developments. She was to waive any right to review corporate financial records. She was to sign a confidentiality agreement regarding family business matters. She was to accept a transitional payment and execute a non-disparagement clause. Then one paragraph stopped her. "Wife acknowledges that she holds no direct or indirect interest in any private lending institution, mortgage investment corporation, or trust entity connected to husband's business financing obligations, and waives all right to review, challenge, or disclose records related to such obligations. She read it a second time, then a third. Her father had once told her that a well-written legal clause was never accidental. Every word had been put there by someone who needed it to be there. A clause this specific, about lenders she had never mentioned, about trusts she had never disclosed to peers, meant that someone in that family had started asking questions, and asking questions meant they were afraid of answers. She called Marlowe Finch. Marlowe Finch, 47, was a family law and private litigation attorney in Toronto who had handled the more sensitive parts of Crispin Dre's estate planning. She was the person Hazel's father had told her to call if love ever became a legal matter. She arrived at the hotel within 2 hours carrying a leather satchel and an expression that suggested she had already started working during the drive. She read the settlement once. She placed her finger on the lender clause and said, "This is not a divorce agreement. This is a liability shield with a signature line." Hazel said, "They want me gone before I know what to ask for." Marlowe looked at her. "Then we ask for everything." In the days that followed, Marlowe issued preservation notices to Norwell Developments, the Norwell Residential Trust holding Ashburn House, and the Norwell Family Legal Office. Every document, every email, every financial record connected to both the marriage and the business was to be preserved under penalty of contempt. Inside Dre Capital's compliance office in Toronto, Leith had convened the Independent Review Committee. The numbers they found were worse than the initial flag suggested. Norwell Developments had submitted 2 separate collateral schedules for the same group of properties, the Barton Road parcels, with different appraised values and different appraisal dates, to 2 different lenders in the same 18-month period. The gap between the values was not a rounding error. It was a fabrication. Beyond the collateral issue, the committee's forensic accountant identified a pattern of expenses from Norwell Development's operating account that did not match their stated categories. A furnished apartment in Toronto's East End had been coded as a client hospitality suite. Interior design services had been filed under contractor costs. Clothing invoices had been submitted under brand presentation. Several entries carried a 2-letter reference code, CD, that appeared repeatedly in the hospitality and accommodation records. CD carries Dunmore. When Orla called Hazel on the 4th day after the departure from Ashburn, her voice was low and careful. "Gideon and I found something," Orla said. "In the estate archive room. We thought you should know before the weekend." She described what they had found, a handwritten memo from Hortense, clipped to a renewal file that read, "Do not disclose collateral history to new lenders. Prior pledges are resolved, HN." They had also found receipts. Corporate invoices, coded under client entertainment, for the same apartment, the same furnishings, the same travel arrangements that had appeared in Dre Capital's audit. And in the back of the archive room, behind a misfiled folder of estate insurance documents, they had found a loan renewal addendum bearing Hazel's name as a guarantor, a signature in her name, a signature she had never made. Hazel looked at the scanned image on her phone for a long time. Her father's voice came back across the years. "Your signature is your consent, Hazel. Guard it the way you would guard a door. Because once someone else holds the key, they can walk through it whenever they like." She sent the image to Marlowe. Within the hour, Marlowe had retained an independent forensic document examiner. The preliminary mediation was held in a rented boardroom in downtown Barrie. Piers arrived in a dark suit with Knox behind him and Fenn carrying the settlement folder. Hortense came separately, wearing the necklace she had taken from Hazel's room. Carries Dunmore came last, uninvited but present, sitting slightly behind Piers' chair in a way that made clear the invitation had been extended privately. Hazel sat across from all of them with Marlowe beside her and a closed folder on the table. Piers leaned back. "This is a straightforward dissolution, Hazel. Don't make it complicated." Hazel said nothing. Marlowe spoke. "Mr. Norwell, did your wife ever contribute personal funds to cover Norwell Development's operational shortfalls or staff costs during the marriage?" Piers answered, "No." Marlowe wrote it down. She looked at Hortense. "Mrs. Norwell, same question, regarding Ashburn House and its estate staff." Hortense lifted her chin. "Hazel contributed her presence, nothing more." Marlowe wrote that down as well. "Mrs. Dunmore." Marlowe turned. "Were any company funds used to cover personal expenses on your behalf? Housing, clothing, furnishings, travel?" Carries held Marlowe's gaze. "Absolutely not." Marlowe set down her pen neatly and opened the folder. She placed 3 documents on the table. The first was a sworn statement from Orla Baxter, confirming that Hortense's memo had been retrieved from the estate archive and that items had been removed from Hazel's personal rooms before she was informed of the divorce proceedings. The second was a sworn statement from Gideon Ash, detailing the double-pledged collateral records he and Orla had photographed before the archive was cleared. The third document was the loan renewal addendum bearing the questioned signature. Pia's face changed. "That is not discoverable," Fenn said too quickly. "It is if it bears my client's name," Marlowe said. Knox closed his eyes. "Every statement made in this room has been recorded with all parties' prior consent," Marlowe said. "Thank you for your answers." Carries looked at Piers looked at the table. Hortense looked at Hazel. Hazel looked at none of them. She was thinking of the ledger her father had kept on his desk in the early years of the firm, when Dre Capital occupied 2 rooms above a hardware store on King Street West, and Crispin Dre had known every client by name. The ledger had been worn at the spine. Her father had called it the most important thing in the office because it was true. Not optimistic, not curated, simply true. She had brought that ledger to the mediation in her bag. She did not take it out. She simply knew it was there. 2 days later, Leith called with the forensic document examiner's findings. The signature on the guarantor addendum was not Hazel's. The letter pressure was inconsistent with her established signing pattern. The character spacing matched a digitally reproduced template. The date stamp on the document did not correspond to any meeting, review, or closing event in Dre Capital's files where Hazel had been present. Someone had generated a document bearing her name and submitted it to secure a lending extension. That was no longer a domestic matter. Leith convened the full board of Dre Capital's independent review committee. Outside legal counsel was retained. The forensic accountant's report was submitted to compliance. Dre Capital's lending counsel filed a notice of irregular documentation with the appropriate provincial regulatory body. 2 days after that, Norwell Development's operating credit line was frozen pending the review outcome. Piers showed up at Dre Capital's Toronto office that Thursday morning with Knox and Fenn, and the particular expression of a man who had spent his life walking into rooms and finding them already arranged to his advantage. He had booked an emergency meeting with the lending committee. He expected to negotiate. What he did not expect was to find Hazel already seated at the head of the table. Leith stood when she entered. "Good morning, Ms. Dre." The room changed in the way a room changes when a foundation shifts. Piers looked at her. His face went through several things very quickly: recognition, calculation, and then something that looked like a man understanding, all at once, an error he could not undo. Hortense, who had come believing the Norwell name still opened doors in this building, looked at the nameplate in front of Hazel and read it twice. She did not speak. Carries sat near the wall, out of place, and already beginning to understand it. Fenn set down his briefcase without opening it. Leith spoke for the record. Hazel Dre is the controlling beneficiary of the Dre Family Trust, which holds majority interest in Dre Capital Group, because submitted loan documents bear her name as a guarantor, a designation she has formally denied. Her presence today is for identity verification and conflict disclosure. The lending decision will be made by the independent committee outside counsel and the board subcommittee. Ms. Dre will not vote. Bettina Chow, 54, Dre Capital's chief compliance officer, placed a printed report in front of each seat. Norwell Developments Limited is in material breach of its loan covenants. Collateral supporting the Lakeview project renewal has been submitted in conflicting schedules to 2 separate lenders in the same review period. The appraised values differ significantly. A spousal guarantor signature has been identified as potentially forged. Loan proceeds traced to client hospitality codes have been matched to expenses incurred for the personal benefit of a third party. She looked once briefly toward Carries. Carries looked at the wall. Bettina continued. The committee's recommendations are as follows: freeze of all discretionary lending access, immediate demand for covenant cure, referral of the questioned document to legal review, and the appropriate regulatory authority, recovery proceedings on pledged collateral in the event of failed cure. Piers pushed back from the table. If you freeze the credit line, the Lakeview project collapses. 50 employees. 50 employees, Hazel said quietly, did not forge my name. The room went still. Piers looked at her. For the first time in 11 years, he looked at her the way a person looks at someone they have underestimated for so long that the underestimation has become a habit they can no longer afford. "You could have told me," he said. His voice was smaller than she had ever heard it. "I could have," Hazel said. I waited to see what you'd respect when you thought I had nothing. Hortense opened her mouth, closed it. Knox stood slowly from his chair. I'd like to speak with outside counsel, independently. Fenn turned on him. Sit down, Knox. Knox looked at Hazel, then at Bertina, then at the report in front of him. I'll cooperate with whatever the review requires, he said. All of it. Hazel placed her father's ledger on the table, not as an exhibit, simply as a presence. She signed the conflict disclosure. She acknowledged her recusal from the lending decision. She authorized the independent committee to proceed according to the trust's founding mandate. Protect the institution, protect honest borrowers, let the record speak. Then she looked at Piers. You told me the night you handed me that envelope that I should accept the settlement without fighting it, she said. That some things were simply bigger than me. She capped her pen. The things that were bigger than you were already in this building. You just never asked what they were. Norwell Developments filed for creditor protection 6 weeks later. The Lakeview project was paused. The Barton Road parcels were called as collateral. Piers' personal guarantees exposed him to liability that outlasted the corporate structure. Fenn resigned from representing the family after the document referral deepened into a regulatory investigation. Hortense, whose handwritten memo had become one of the committee's primary exhibits, moved out of Ashburn when the estate's pledged assets were placed under court-monitored receivership. Carrie Dunmore's name appeared on 17 expense submissions tied to company accounts. She retained her own lawyer, cooperated with the review, and returned the items tied to the corporate records. She gave a statement. She did not contact Piers again. Aldrich Norwell, 39, Piers' younger brother and a minority board member, who had watched the collapse from the edge of things for weeks, called Hazel directly one afternoon. I want you to know I didn't know about the documents, he said. I believe you, she said. Is there anything I can do? She thought about it. Make sure the junior staff understand what happened, not the family version, what actually happened. He was quiet. I'll try, he said. That was enough. Through the Dre Foundation, which had operated quietly under Crispin Dre's charitable mandate for 2 decades, Hazel arranged a transition fund for Norwell Development's employees who had worked in good faith and lost income through the collapse. Severance assistance, employment placement support, emergency grants for those with families dependent on the November payroll that had failed. Orla retired with full back pay and a commendation letter Hazel wrote herself. Gideon received a formal settlement for unpaid overtime, accrued over 7 years that Hortense had classified as a discretionary matter. Knox, whose cooperation had been early and documented, avoided the worst of the regulatory exposure. The final divorce order arrived on a Thursday morning in January, when the Ontario sky was the color of worn linen, and the roads were still icy from the night before. Marlowe called before Hazel had finished her first cup of coffee. It's done, Marlowe said. The court recognized the financial misconduct. The confidentiality clause was struck. The lender waiver clause was struck. You're free. Hazel looked out the window of the small apartment she had rented in Barrie. Across the street, a woman was scraping ice off her car with the focused efficiency of someone who had done it 1,000 times and had stopped being annoyed by it. She went back to Ashburn once, not to reclaim anything. The court-appointed receiver needed her signature on 2 documents related to estate staff housing arrangements that required the trust's authorization to transfer. She drove up on a grey February morning when the fields alongside the highway were flat and white, and the sky looked like it was considering more snow. Orla met her at the door. Gideon stood a few feet back with his cap in his hands. You look well, Orla said. Then she caught herself. You look like yourself. Hazel smiled. That's the same thing. She walked through the front hall. The chandelier still caught the winter light. The staircase was quiet. The rooms that had been dressed for investors and dinners and performances of a life looked smaller now. Or perhaps she had simply stopped measuring herself against them. She signed the documents at the hall table, the same table where Fenn had once laid the envelope that was supposed to erase her, and handed the copies to the receiver's assistant. At the door, she stopped and looked back once. She saw Hortense on the staircase holding the keys. Carrie's by the fireplace, Piers with the envelope, the November rain and one bag. Then she saw the boardroom, Piers going pale, Bertina reading the compliance report, the ledger open on the table, the room that had not arranged itself for anyone's advantage. She turned and walked out into the cold. The charitable recovery program opened in February in a rented office on Dunlop Street. No ceremony, no press release. A quiet sign, a phone line, and 4 staff members. Former Norwell employees came in the first week. More came the second. On a Thursday evening in late February, Hazel sat alone in Dre Capital's Toronto boardroom after the day's work was done. The city outside the tall windows was blue with early dark, and the lights from the towers across the street were coming on one by one the way they did every evening, indifferent to the things that had happened in this room and in every other room in the city where someone had once believed they could disappear another person with the right paperwork. She placed her father's ledger on the table. She thought about Crispin Dre standing in the original office, with its low ceiling and its 2 chairs and its view of King Street on a rainy afternoon, telling his 22-year-old daughter, "Ownership is not a weapon, Hazel. It is a responsibility. The day it becomes something you use against people instead of for them, you've already lost the point of it." She had tried to remember that through all of it. Through the review, the mediation, the boardroom, the collapse, the January morning when the court gave her back her voice. She had not always succeeded. There had been a night in the Barry hotel room when she held the forensic document report and felt something that was not quite satisfaction but was close enough to worry her. She had put the report down and made tea and sat with the feeling until it passed into something quieter and truer. Grief for the years spent quietly making things work for people who had spent those same years deciding she was decorative. That grief had its own weight. It did not dissolve with a court order. But it moved eventually, the way rivers moved under January ice, slowly underground in the dark, until the conditions changed. She closed the ledger, turned off the boardroom light, walked to the elevator. In the lobby, the night security guard gave her a small nod. Outside, the cold came in off the bay, and the snow had started again, fine and dry, catching in the light from the building's entrance. Hazel pulled her coat closed and walked toward the street. Some women discover their power only after someone has tried to take it from them. But Hazel Dre had carried it the whole time, in a trust document, in a worn ledger, in every quiet decision she had made, while someone louder stood in front of the room and called himself the reason the lights stayed on. The betrayal had not made her powerful. It had simply made everyone else find out. Subscribe to Broken Pledge Tales and comment Dre if you believe a quiet woman is not a powerless one. She is simply choosing the right moment to let the record speak for her.